Welcome to Pressure Points. Our topic today is it time for Tim Cook to move on? And I wanted to have a level headed conversation on the topic. It is of maybe more significance in the news, obviously, because of Jeff Williams announcing his retirement at the end of the year, and separately, a story in the Washington Post. I'm going to read the headline: Apple faces existential problems and is in need of new blood. Very clear path there. And the pressure point is that now is the time for Cook to stay with the company. Apple needs Cook for 5 different reasons. And I've thought a lot about this since the Williams announcement. And I come back to the role of Cook, even though people talk about this shift in AI and what's going on with the products, but Cook's role, the role of Apple's CEO, is more akin to the president of a country than it is the CEO of a company. And I want to put a little bit of perspective on that. Is Apple's revenue is $400 billion, which if you kind of put that in the mix of GDPs, it would kind of land it right around 35th and kind of the same size as, call it, Ireland. But the impact of Apple, of course, goes well beyond its revenue. And if you look at the app developer community, that's total annual revenue to app developers is about 1.3 trillion. So if you add those together, you factor in that there's approximately 5 million jobs in the US and Europe related to that earn their livelihood based on Apple, and then probably another couple million in China. So between US, China, and Europe, you're talking about 7 million jobs. So when you start to think about adding these together, you kind of get to this GDP, effective GDP of more like $2 trillion plus dollars, which puts it kind of in the same category as Canada or Brazil. So a reason why I think that context is important is this is a very different role. Like running Apple is very different than running a typical company. And let's kind of jump into those 5 points that are the substance of why I think that Cook should remain. And first is that at the highest level, it is like running a country, and nobody does it better when it comes to managing the geopolitical side. Despite some of the friction recently between the White House, if you look at the breadth of Cook's work, not only with the first Trump administration more recently, but also everything that's going on with China and trying to manage the production there, but also try to shift it to other countries. That geopolitical piece is really important. Second, I would say he is world-class in terms of managing the regulatory environment. And there has been pressure on Apple for the past 7+ years for friction related to regulators. And I think one of the testimonies that he's done a good job of navigating this is that nothing effectively has happened. But there are changes that have been forced. Apple has been creative in terms of how to kind of essentially work around those changes. And I would say there has been no big shifts in terms of their business. And anything that has come out, they've essentially effectively navigated around, as evidenced by the growth rate in services that has been a particular point of interest for regulators. But services growth continues kind of in that low single double digit area. The next reason is that Cook knows how to keep teams together. The senior leadership, if you look at mega cap tech, keep in mind that these leaders make a boatload of money. They don't need to work. Typically, if you're in a senior leadership role, within a couple of years, you've made enough money that there's no way you could spend it for the rest of your life. And so a lot of them tend to move on. But when you look at Apple, they've done a great job. There has been turnover, most notably Johnny Ive was probably the biggest one. Phil Schiller leaving in 2020 it was time for him to retire. He was getting older. And if you look at Scott Forstall back in 2012, that was more Apple's decision. But outside of that, they've kept that kind of core team together. Greg Jaws, he's been with the company since 1986. I mean, it's crazy. And so I think that that's really important when you think about culture kind of and consistency. So he does a great job of keeping the team together. The fourth point is that he's hyper competitive. I think kind of his quiet personality. My interactions with him and side conversations has always this sense about him wanting to win and be competitive. And I think he often gets painted as a picture of being more of a peacetime type of a CEO. I think he's got more of a fight in the competition narrative to him than people recognize. And the fifth and final point is, in terms of AI and this existential risk to the company, I believe that. I believe that this is the biggest pivot point, the biggest opportunity for competition to get into Apple's business. But I also believe that Cook recognizes that, and he's going to make all the steps he has in the past. He's been through big transformations in the past, and specifically, as he has been there as Apple has reinvented itself each decade a few times. So when it went from being a computer company to a device company with the iPod and iPhone, he was, even though he wasn't CEO, he played a critical role in that. Obviously, the shift from devices to services, that was all him. And now we're going from services into AI. And so he's got that track record. He recognizes that it made the mistake of not moving fast enough. That's a knock, but I think that he ultimately gets it and will deliver, whether it's through bigger, better partnerships with Anthropic or an acquisition of Perplexity. He's going to get this figured out. The history would suggest that. So those are the 5 points that I believe that Cook should remain CEO. I do want to shift gears and talk about, eventually Cook is not going to be CEO, that he's 64 years old. My sense is he probably has 3 years left. And at that point, the reins are starting to slowly get groomed for handing this over to what it seems to be John Ternus. And he is the most likely person. He joined Apple in 2001. And I just would point out that John's relationship with Tim, it's important because it is kind of a similar grooming process that went on with obviously Steve and Tim. And I think that Steve Jobs point, the legacy of Steve Jobs, is to create consistent, a very trained, well thought of transition when it comes to the most senior leadership, and transitioning that to the most people who understand Apple and the culture and who have been around the most. And so this idea that they're going to bring in some fresh blood essentially would violate, I think, the legacy of Steve Jobs. And that is so important for Apple's leadership, is to maintain that North Star. And so I think that the probability that anything happens abruptly is low. And ultimately, I think Cook is the one who's going to be in charge for the next few years, lead Apple to where the AI future is very clearly defined, and then eventually hand off to John to be the future CEO. I think he's like 50 years old, so he'd be in a great position to handle that role. On behalf of Pressure Points, I'm Gene. Bye for now.